Hi, it's been a while since the last uploaded video, so my apologies about that. As a result of the long gap between the videos, we're just going to take a moment to assess where we've gotten to throughout the series, and we're going to take a moment as well to kind of plan what our next steps are going to be in the following videos. So I've got the project open in front of me with the progress at the state where we left it. So far, we've imported the LiDAR-based terrain tile, which comprises the playable area. We've imported a background mesh, which is lower res and not based off of LiDAR data, which extends up to the horizon. We've also set up a material for the landscape that uses the material layers system, which gives us a whole degree of flexibility and control as we move forwards and develop this terrain further. So the way that I've structured these videos, although it's been quite loosely structured, is in a kind of iterative approach to building the terrain. So the goal isn't to go in the first time and to create the perfect end result for each step straight away. No, what we're doing is we're trying to get to the quickest visible result as fast as possible with every component that's going to make up our final terrain. And once we've set up that pipeline between Houdini, Unreal, and whatever other tools that we need to use to complete the terrain, then we can iterate on each level, each stage, each part of the terrain, one by one, perhaps twice more for each component. So what I mean by that is we've already imported the splat maps for the terrain, which we can visualize. If we hit Shift 2 and go down to the landscape visualizers and have a look at the layer debug, and then if we go into the paint mode and have a look in here at our different layers, we can hit R, G, and B. And that's going to show us the layers that we imported in part 2 of this tutorial series. So we're going to go back and we'll readdress these at some point. So I'll make a little note of that. Update layer weight maps. Now, if I hit Shift 1 to switch out of the landscape mode, we'll get back to our view. We've also got some other issues that we need to address. For example, the tiling is still somewhat visible on the terrain, and that's down to a few factors. So the first factor that I'm going to bring up is that we're not really using appropriate macro scale textures. So if I open up the landscape material here and we have a look at the texture, we can see two things. Firstly, we can see that it's very dark, even though this is a supposedly calibrated texture from the Megascans library. So we're going to have to update the detail textures to be more appropriate. And what else can we see? We can see that in this texture, we have individual plant stems, grasses, and small details that would only be fitting within sort of a 1 by 1 meter tile on the terrain. So when we scale that up massively to fill a very large portion of the terrain, not only is the repetition highly noticeable, but we also can see those individual blades of grass. If I just go and force the exposure for a second, that's going to become even more apparent that when we're zoomed out here, you find it's very hard to actually get a sense of how far we are from the ground there, as the individual blades of grass are visible from a sort of aerial perspective. So that's not correct. So we're going to need to find or create more appropriate macro textures. Okay, those two things by themselves are going to go a long way to improving the look and feel of this terrain. But we're going to go a bit further than that too. We're going to introduce more layers and more variation. And when those things are all taken together, we're going to end up with a terrain that looks like it's been plucked straight out of a blockbuster AAA game like Battlefield or Battlefront, World of Tanks. Okay, so that's how we're going to improve the quality of our near terrain. So what are we going to do about the background? Let's have a little look out. When I fly out like this, the volumetric clouds are getting in the way. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn those off. You can see we've also got a bit of fog going on. So I'm going to go and disable the fog preview for a second. And I'm going to switch the exposure down a little bit so it's not as bright. There we go. So I can see what I'm doing slightly better. Now, I don't actually have any texturing on the background terrain yet. So that's quite an obvious next step. I'm just going to go in there and add that too. So we need to add background terrain texturing. And it's going to be important to blend the background and foreground terrain. Okay, so what else can we see here? If I select the background terrain, I'm actually going to hit Alt 5 to go out of the color, so I can no longer see the texture. So I'm just switching to lighting only, and actually that means I'm going to have to pull the exposure down up a little bit, down. I'm going to have to pull the exposure down a little bit so we can actually see the details of the terrain. And if we just look at it from the perspective of what kind of mesh or terrain components we have, we obviously have that inner tile, which looks great already from a mesh perspective, from a geometry perspective. And we have the background tile. So if I go and select that too, and just quickly hit Alt 2 to flick, okay, we can see that actually the background terrain here is just one giant component. Okay, so that's not ideal. And what else is going on? Well, we can see that there's a uniform density of triangles pretty much from the playable area up to the edge of the terrain. So there's a couple of issues here. The first issue that I'm going to bring up is if we're sort of down in the middle of the terrain, let's say we're actually flying above it as a drone and we're looking in this direction, we can actually only see about 1/3 of the overall tile. So if I was just going to open Paint quickly, you can see we have our inner terrain here. Please excuse my terrible drawing skills. And we have our background terrain here, which isn't to scale. And we've got our player position, which is right in the middle of the terrain. And we have a view frustum, which is sort of something like this. The issue is, when we're looking in this direction, we're actually still drawing the entire terrain when ideally we want to cut out, I wonder if this will work. No, that's not going to work. Okay, where ideally we actually want to cut out everything that the player isn't seeing. Now, we're not going to be able to do that perfectly because we don't want to split the background terrain up into too many little chunks. But what we can do is we can slice up the background terrain into a sort of a number of chunks that's not too much, not too few. So for example, we could cut it into 4 chunks, as you see here, and then we'll only be loading 2 of the background terrain chunks. So what we're trading off there is we're getting more draw calls, but we're going to be rendering less triangles. And you can continue to push that even further, and you can divide that background terrain up into smaller and smaller slices. Just bear in mind that you will be introducing more draw calls if you do so. I think this is a good number of slices, kind of a pizza slice of the background terrain. So what's that? That's going to give us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or 8 slices. And then we also need to tackle the other issue, which is that the density of the mesh remains constant right from the border of the playable area all the way up to out of bounds there. And you can see that if we're floating in the middle of the terrain there, that background terrain is almost pure yellow, even in wireframe view. So that means we're going to be getting a lot of quad overdraw. So if I just go down to the optimization view modes and turn on quad overdraw, you can see that we're getting quite a lot of green over there on the horizon, which, considering it's a background terrain, is totally unnecessary. And it's definitely meaning we're drawing way more triangles than we can actually see from our position here in the playable area. So we're going to cut the background terrain up into slices, and we're also going to have a fall off of triangle density further away from the terrain. Okay, so not quite done. I'm just going to go back up and hit show defaults, and I'm going to go turn the game settings on. We're going to re-enable those clouds again so we can see where we're currently at. And if we fly down to ground level here, you can see we're obviously missing something quite important, which is we don't have any detail meshes at all scattered on our terrain. And that's going to really severely kind of downgrade the quality of experience for anyone who's running about on that landscape. I'm not sure this is going to work, but I'm going to just go ahead and hit play in selected viewport. Okay, yeah, so I haven't got the game mode set up with a player yet. So we'll do 2 things here. We're going to set up a third-person character if we haven't already, so you can run around the landscape and look at it as if it's a third-person action game. And we're also going to set up detail meshes, for example, grass, rocks, that we scatter on the terrain. Beyond that, we're not going to plan any steps further than that, because that's going to take us to the point where the base layer for the terrain is kind of finished and everything above that level becomes kind of set dressing and needs to be a little bit more hand authored and takes some kind of like other approaches and other tools. So, okay, let's have a little look at our to-do list. What tools do we think we're going to be using as we move through the production here and finish up this terrain, do a few more iterations on it? Well, Updating the layer weight maps is quite easy. We're just going to stick with Houdini for that one, as we know how to use that already, and we're just going to go a little bit deeper into the kind of layering of effects and masks that we can do with that. And we're going to update the detail textures to be more appropriate. Well, we're going to continue to use the Mega Scans library. We're just going to find some more appropriate textures, and we might have a little look in Mixer to see what we can do to kind of mix those together to create sort of more appropriate and varied textures with less noticeable repetition. What about the find or create more appropriate macro textures? Since I'm aiming to keep the rest of this series as short as possible, we're not going to be going and looking at capturing our own surfaces using drone data. Instead of that, we're going to be looking at using freely available online resources, which are available only for non-commercial applications. We're going to be using Google Maps images, so you won't be able to use this approach on a commercial project. And we're also possibly going to be looking again at how do we use Mixer and Megascans to craft our own inverted commas aerial perspective landscape textures. Sorry, not materials. So when it comes to creating more layers and more variation, that is going to be in Houdini, and it's going to make use of those above two steps where we source more textures, both from Megascans and Google Maps. And with the background terrain texturing, we're going to be doing that in Houdini as well and using those same maps. What else are we going to do? Well, with the blending of the background and the foreground terrain, that's going to take us into Houdini. And with cutting up the background terrain slices, the same tool again and again here as well. When it comes to setting up a third-person character, that's going to be in Unreal. We're going to keep that really simple. We're not going to do anything from scratch. We're just going to use the templates. And when it comes to setting up detail meshes, we are, of course, going to use Megascans since it's freely available. And we're going to use other marketplace free content. And finally, that's all going to be done direct in Unreal. Okay, so we've got a kind of map of the road ahead. And I'm just going to add one more thing here, which is we're going to iterate on the master landscape material using material layers. And we're going to improve everything from the blending to having more control to laying things out just in a slightly more logical and effective manner. So that's going to be all taking place inside of Unreal. Okay, so that's it. That's the plan for the road ahead. It's going to take up several videos, and I'm going to get started on the next one right away. So see you on the other side, and thanks for sticking with this series for so long. Okay, bye.